The courthouse steps were ordinary. This is worth noting, because everything about the Miami proceedings had been organized by the press and the public imagination into something larger and more charged than ordinary, a confrontation between a generation and its institutions, between the performing body and the state's authority over it, between the specifically American mythology of freedom and the specifically American reality of what happened to people who tested that mythology in public. The charges arising from the Dinner Key Auditorium on March 1st, 1969, had been generating their particular kind of cultural electricity for more than a year by the time Jim Morrison and Max Fink arrived at the Dade County Courthouse for the trial. The courthouse steps, when they actually stood on them, were just steps. Max Fink had been preparing the defense for over a year. This was not an exaggeration. The Miami proceedings had moved with a particular slowness of criminal cases that become complicated by their own public significance, the legal calendar expanding to accommodate the weight of what the case had become in the culture before the court could make the more limited determination of what it was in law. Max Fink had used the time. He had reviewed the evidence. He had identified the witnesses. He had built a framework within which the defense would present the events of the Dinner Key Auditorium in the form that the law required them to be presented, which was a form of facts and sequence and the categories that the charges named. He had read the poem Jim had given him instead of the factual statement, for times, and had understood what it told him about how to construct the argument. He was prepared. Jim Morrison arrived at the courthouse with a quality of attention that Max Fink had learned, over the year of the proceedings, to read accurately. Not calm exactly. Jim Morrison, in the institutional context that the Miami case required, was never entirely calm, because institutions consistently produce in him the specific discomfort of someone whose relationship to authority had been defined, since the naval family houses of his childhood, by the gap between what institutions required and what the actual self could provide. But he was present. He was in a condition that Max Fink had come to recognize as the best available condition for what the day required. Attended without being performing, accessible without being managed. They had 5 minutes before the doors opened and the morning session began. Jim Morrison stopped on the steps, not because the steps required stopping, not because he had reached a decision point or a necessary pause. He stopped in the way he sometimes stopped in the middle of ordinary movement, because something had occurred to him, because the interior had produced something that the exterior motion had to accommodate. He reached into the pocket of his jacket. He had a notebook. He opened it to a page. He looked at the page, and then he looked at Max Fink, and he said, "I want to read you something." Max Fink said, "We have 5 minutes." Jim said, "I know." Max said, "All right." And Jim Morrison, on the steps of the Dade County Courthouse with 5 minutes before the morning session of his own trial, read from William Blake. Max Fink has described a specific passage in general terms. He has not quoted it precisely, or not in the accounts that are publicly available, because the precision belonged to the moment and to the person who brought it, and that person is not here to confirm the precision. What Max has said is that it was from the Proverbs of Hell, the section of the marriage of heaven and hell that Blake organized around the aphorisms that express the energy principle, the understanding that what the institutional world named excess and transgression was, from the other side of the institutional framework, the condition of genuine life, of the real rather than the managed, of the thing itself rather than the sanctioned approximation of the thing. The Proverbs of Hell. In the 5 minutes before the morning session of the trial arising from the Dinner Key Auditorium, Jim Morrison read Max Fink the Proverbs of Hell. Max Fink listened. He had been a lawyer for long enough to understand the specific condition of a client on the morning of a trial, the specific mix of controlled and the uncontrolled, the professional and the personal, the calculation and the genuine. He had stood on courthouse steps many times. He had not previously stood on courthouse steps while a client read him William Blake with 5 minutes to go. He listened with the attention he brought to everything Jim Morrison said that was important, which was the attention of someone who understood that what Jim Morrison said was usually more relevant to proceedings than it appeared. But to understand what Jim Morrison was doing on the courthouse steps, what Blake and the Proverbs of Hell meant in the specific context of the morning of the Miami trial, you have to understand what Jim Morrison had been living with for the year since the Dinner Key Auditorium and what the trial represented in that context. The Miami evening had been, from Jim Morrison's interior understanding of it, the fullest extension of the project, the pressing of performance against the limits of form until the limits gave way. He had not planned it in the sense of a premeditated action. He had arrived at it through the accumulation of pressure and the specific conditions of that evening, through the year of performing that had built toward whatever March 1st, 1969 turned out to be. What had happened in the Dinner Key Auditorium was a natural terminal of a year of pressing. The charges that followed named what had happened in the categories the law had available for naming it: indecent exposure, lewd and lascivious behavior, profanity, drunkenness. These were the categories. They were not wrong as descriptions of the external facts. They described what the actions looked like from the outside, from the position of the law, which assessed actions and not the interior understanding of the actions. But they were not the interior understanding. They were the law's version of what had happened, and the law's version and Jim Morrison's version were not the same version. Blake had been pressing against this gap his entire life. The Proverbs of hell were the most compressed form of that pressing. Aphorisms that said directly what the institutional framework of his era was organized to prevent from being said, that named the thing the institution called transgression as a thing that was actually life, that refused the institution's categories as the final word on what human energy was and what it was for. The road of excess leads to the palace of wisdom. Energy is eternal delight. Those who restrain desire do so because theirs is weak enough to be restrained. Jim Morrison had been reading Blake since his early teens. He had been living inside the Blake understanding. The understanding that the energy the institutions constrained was the energy that the genuine life required for the entirety of his career. The doors had been the form that this understanding took in the medium of music. The Dinner Key Auditorium had been what happened when the form was pressed to its fullest extension. And now he was on the courthouse steps, and the courthouse was the institution that was going to determine the legal consequence of having pressed the form to its fullest extension. And he had 5 minutes, and he had the notebook, and he had Max Fink beside him, and he read the Proverbs of hell. Max Fink listened. He heard the Blake. He understood, in the specific way that a lawyer who has been preparing a defense for a year understands things that confirm the defense's framework, that what Jim Morrison was doing on the courthouse steps was not irrelevant to what was about to happen inside the courthouse. It was, in fact, more relevant than anything that would be said inside the courthouse. Not because Blake could be cited in the opening argument, he could not, but because what Blake was describing was a framework inside which the events of the Dinner Key Auditorium made sense. And the framework inside which the events made sense was a framework the defense needed to communicate, in the language the law required, to the jury that would determine the outcome. Energy is eternal delight. The road of excess leads to the palace of wisdom, not the excess of absence of reason, not the excess of self-destruction, but the excess of genuine engagement with the actual world, as against the managed version of the world that the institutions provided and required. The palace of wisdom was not reached by the road of careful management. It was reached by the road of pressing all the way, of taking the form to its fullest extension, of finding the edge not through calculation, but through the accumulated velocity of genuine engagement. Jim Morrison had taken the performance to its fullest extension on March 1st, 1969. Whatever had happened in the Dinner Key Auditorium was the result of that extension. And here, on the courthouse steps, with 5 minutes before the morning session, he was reading to his lawyer the framework in which that extension made sense, not as a legal defense, not in a language that the court could use, but in the only language that the thing actually fit. Max Fink said, when the reading was done, "I understand." Jim Morrison said, "I know you do." Then the doors opened, and they went inside. Max Fink built the defense from what he understood, not from Blake. Blake was not in the argument, not in the evidence, not in the examination of witnesses. But the understanding that Blake had put on the courthouse steps was in everything the defense did. In the framework it offered the jury for understanding what the Dinner Key Auditorium had been, in the context it established of the actions the charges described, in the specific quality of the attention Max Fink brought to the morning that had started on those steps. Jim Morrison was convicted on 2 counts. Max Fink appealed. The appeal was in progress when Jim Morrison died in Paris in July 1971. The case closed with his death. What remained after the case closed was what remained of everything Jim Morrison did. The specific residue of the genuine thing, the evidence of the pressing, the mark left by someone who had taken the form to its fullest extension and had read Blake on courthouse steps while waiting for the law to determine the consequence. Max Fink kept the morning. He carried the courthouse steps in the 5 minutes, and the Proverbs of hell in the specific way that lawyers carry the things that clients say that are more relevant than they appear. He said, in the years after Jim Morrison's death, I had many clients who did unexpected things on the morning of their trials. Jim Morrison read me William Blake, and I went inside and argued the case better than I would have without the Blake, because the Blake was the truth of the case. And the truth of the case as a lawyer is the most useful thing a client can give you. Jim Morrison read Blake on Courthouse steps with 5 minutes to go, and Max Fink understood, and they went inside. That was the morning of the Miami trial. What Max Fink carried from the courthouse steps into the courtroom was not a quotation from Blake, and not a legal strategy derived from Blake, and not anything that could be formally connected to the 5 minutes on the steps in the argument he was about to make. What he carried was the understanding, the specific, clear, felt understanding of the framework in which the events of the Dinner Key Auditorium made sense, in the form that the framework became available in when Jim Morrison put it on the steps with a notebook open to the Proverbs of hell. He had understood the framework before the steps. He had built the defense from his understanding of it, which had been developing since he took the case, and had been most directly informed by the poem Jim had given him instead of the factual statement. The poem he had read 4 times and had used to construct the defense's argument about what the Dinner Key Auditorium had been. He had understood that the events of March 1st, 1969 were not the events the charges named them as, were not the actions of a person who had decided to violate public decency for its own sake or for theatrical shock of the violation, but the actions of a person who had taken the form to its fullest extension in the same spirit that had produced everything the form had ever produced, and that the fullest extension had exceeded the limits that the law maintained around public performance. The Blake confirmed this understanding in the most concentrated form available. The Proverbs of hell were the most direct statement of the principle that organized the framework, the principle that the energy the institutions restrained was the energy that genuine life required, that the road of excess was a road that led somewhere rather than a road that led nowhere, that the wisdom was on the other side of the pressing rather than on the side of the management. Jim Morrison had taken performance as far as a performance would go on March 1st, 1969. He had gone all the way, and the going all the way had produced the charges that were now before the court. Max Fink argued the case. He argued in the language the law required, using the evidence and the witnesses and the legal framework that the defense had constructed over the year of preparation. He did not mention Blake. He did not quote the Proverbs of hell to the jury. He argued the case in the form that the case required, in the form that the law could receive. But the understanding he brought to the argument was the understanding that had been confirmed on the courthouse steps, and that understanding was the understanding that the Blake named. The events of the Dinner Key Auditorium were the events of a person pressing to the fullest available extension of the form. They were not transgression in the sense of violation for its own sake. They were the fullest extension of the same project that the performances had always been engaged in, the closing of the distance, the putting of the thing in the room, the energy that was not restrained because the restraining would have made it something else, something less than the genuine article. Pamela Corson was not at the trial. She was aware of it, followed it from the Laurel Canyon house, in the specific way of someone who has been given the daily account by the person who is living through it. She received Jim's account of the courthouse steps in the abbreviated form, that he gave accounts of important things, a fragment, the essential. He told her about the Blake. She did not ask which passage. She knew which kind of passage. She had been living with Jim Morrison long enough to know which Blake he reached for when the reaching was not performance, but actual reaching, the reaching toward the thing he needed to get through what the day was going to require of him. She said, "Of course." He said, Max understood. She said, of course he understood. Ray Manzarek heard the story of the courthouse steps from Jim in one of the conversations that the trial period produced, the conversations about the proceedings that Jim had with the people closest to him, the accounts that were not for public consumption, and that were the honest version of what the proceedings were. Ray heard the Blake passage described, heard which section, heard what Jim said Max Fink's response was, and sat with in the way he sat with most things that connected the music to the larger project of what Jim Morrison had always been doing. Then he said, "That's the whole case in a few lines. The road of excess." Jim said, "Yes." Ray said, "And Max got it." Jim said, "Max got it." John Densmore processed the courthouse step story the way he processed most things connected to Miami proceedings. with the specific weight of someone who had been at the Dinner Key Auditorium, who had been behind the drums on March 1st, 1969, who had watched what had happened from the position of having been inside it. He understood the Blake without needing the explanation, because he had been there when the road of excess was being traveled, and had understood what the traveling was in the same way that the people who were inside the event understand it, even when the understanding cannot be made into language that the court can receive. He said, the whole trial was that problem. How do you explain the road of excess to the people who are in the business of building the fence? This was the most concise available description of the Miami proceedings. The people who are in the business of building the fence. The law was a fence. The fence was not wrong to exist. Fences were necessary. But the fence and the road were not in the same relationship to each other that the fence imagined them to be, and the trial was the attempt to use the fence's language to describe the road, which was a translation problem that no defense, however skillfully constructed, could entirely solve.